Hi, welcome to Deep End. My name doesn't matter. Let's dive in. So, I want to talk to you about Andrew Bryan today. Andrew Bryan was a slave who became a preacher who changed the face of ministry. He's one of the first Baptist pastors, first black Baptist pastors in Georgia. And he is, I would also consider him to be one of the first church planters in the New World. He starts multiple churches. So Andrew Bryan was born a slave on Brampton Plantation in 1730. He had a master named Jonathan Bryan, who that's where he gets his last name from. But he had this master Jonathan Bryan, who by all accounts was a pretty decent human being. Of course, we struggle to accept that because slavery's bad, and it's hard for us to see how you can be decent and have such a large blind spot. But he's educated by Jonathan. He grows up with his family. Jonathan is very close to Andrew Bryan's family. His dad is there, his brother's there. He's got family that he grows up with on this plantation. He meets George Whitefield very often. George Whitefield was a close friend of Jonathan Bryan, and Jonathan Bryan was a giver to George Whitefield's ministry, and so George Whitefield showed up pretty often when Andrew Bryan was young. Around about the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s, George Liele shows up on the scene and he begins to preach at various plantations. Remember in the video before about George Liele, he was a slave who was granted his freedom and became a preacher, and he becomes the first African-American Baptist pastor in the States, and then the first missionary period, the American-born missionary, and he goes to Jamaica. So before he goes to Jamaica, he's preaching, and he preaches on the Brampton Plantation, and Andrew Bryan hears him and believes and becomes a Christian. So he starts preaching alongside of George Liele somewhere around the 1780s. He starts preaching alongside George Liele, and Jonathan Bryan sees such a beautiful proclamation of the gospel that he tells Andrew Bryan, why don't you use the barn as a church? And so call all the slaves in and preach in this barn. The only thing I would ask is that you don't encourage insurrection or rebellion. But preach the gospel. These people need to know Jesus. They need to be saved. So preach the gospel. And so he would call them into the barn, and they would have church in this big barn. Jonathan opened his barn to Andrew, kind of gave it to him as a church for a long time. When Liele goes to Jamaica, when George Liele starts the first Black Baptist church in Savanah, his former master dies, and fearing that he'll be locked up, he flees to Jamaica and becomes a missionary there. And as we talked about in the other village, thousands of people become believers in Jamaica because of George Liele's ministry. But Andrew Bryan takes over preaching in the first African Baptist church in Savannah, as well as the Brampton Barn, as well as another area called the Yamacraw village that was owned by a guy named Edward Davis. And so he gathers people, and he's got such a great, fierce preaching, and he's such a good preacher that he starts gathering crowds, and African Americans are coming from all over to hear him preach. And so from 1788 to I think somewhere around 1800, the church that he is pastoring goes from 69 members to over 800. And it's just this massive crowd. So he's gathering these massive crowds, and in particular at Yamacraw Village. And so he's gathering this massive crowd of Africans to hear him preach. And this made the white slave owners and white masters uncomfortable. So they frequently would interrupt and try to drive these services away, and they would cause all kinds of issues. They would arrest Andrew Bryan, and his brother would be arrested multiple times for preaching to slaves, which they did all the time, and it was illegal to preach the gospel to slaves, but they did it anyway, and they would get arrested for it, and then they'd go out and they'd do it again, they'd get arrested for it. So they were arrested a couple times. He was He was beaten. He was whipped. He was scorned by white slave owners. He was jeered and mocked. He was all kinds of persecution fell on Andrew Bryan's shoulders, and yet the power of the gospel, he taught that he was lifted above the circumstances to be able to preach the gospel and to find joy in the midst of all circumstances. So he continually and faithfully preached the gospel in every place he was able. He went up and down the Savanah River preaching and founding churches. In 1788, Jonathan Bryan died and left him 95 pounds and a note that said, with this 95 pounds, buy your freedom and preach the gospel. So his gift of 95 pounds was conditioned on the idea that he would preach the gospel to the lost and that people would be saved. Jonathan Bryan passes away, gives him money, so he goes and he buys his freedom from Jonathan's brother, and then he buys some land, and then he has some more land given to him by James Whitfield, who gives him a little bit more land to live on. In 1805, the three churches that Bryan primarily preached at, the Savanah, they came together to make the Savanah Baptist Association, the Savanah River Baptist Association. And that association existed for a long, long time. Bryan pastored for 24 years in incredible hardship and died at the age of 92, a faithful soldier of the gospel who preached amidst incredible persecution, persecution that we can't imagine. Could you imagine going to church and there's 700 people that are showing up to hear you preach, and when they get there, they are confronted by men with guns telling them to go home, and whips, literally beating their slaves to go home, beating these men to go home and tell them that they can't worship the living God? Can you imagine the difficulty that this man faced? And no, you can't, because we're upset about having to wear masks in a grocery store. So here in Savannah, in Georgia, in Yamacraw, and in Brampton Plantation, Andrew Bryan shows us this incredible example of what it means to be a preacher of the gospel, that you preach the gospel first above all else, and that you work hard to show people the life of Christ, which elevates you above the circumstances of this life. I have discovered the secret that whether in want or in plenty, in sickness or in health, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So his teaching held in high value families. It held in high value the family structure, and marriage was held in high honor, and being married and raising kids was something high value to him. Second thing that he preached pretty clearly was that the gospel elevates us from our circumstances, but does not always remove us from them. He was a slave until his master died and set him free, and he knew what it meant to be a slave. And he knew that he was not, the gospel didn't necessarily free him from his slavery, but it did lift him above that circumstance. And I do believe that the gospel should pervade the heart of everybody, and that slavery should cease to exist where the gospel is in power. So he would preach that the gospel elevates our soul above our circumstances and allows us to live in an elevated life. And then finally, he wasn't just talk about freedom. His churches also operated as part of the Underground Railroad. And so when there were these holes in one of the churches that he pastored, there were these holes in the ground that were done in certain patterns and structures. And the rumor that he let circulate was that these were African patterns and African patterns in the ground. And so there were holes that were kind of hearkening back to the African heritage. But the truth is they were breathing holes cut out in patterns so nobody would question too much. Because underneath the floor of the basement was a sub-basement with tunnels that went out it. And so they would hide escaping slaves in those tunnels, and those those slaves would escape through the Underground Railroad that way. A beautiful truth that the gospel demands us to take action sometimes for the sake of true freedom, both freedom in this life and freedom in the next. So that's Andrew Bryan. I hope that encouraged you. Take time to breathe today. Thanks for joining me, Deep End. Now go get to work.